What if the greatest empire the world ever saw didn't end? What if it simply shifted from stone to memory, from fire to silence, waiting to be found in forgotten roads, hidden tombs, and half-buried names? I stood where the throne once stood, in Persepolis, under a sky that hadn't changed in 25 centuries. The air was thick with dust and questions. How did a boy from the highlands of Anshan ignite a flame that reached Babylon without blood? Why did 10,000 warriors vanish into myth? And who really paid the price for their silence? What secrets lie in the royal highway that stitched empires together, or in the temples where fire still burns after 1,000 years? Who wrote the letter we found buried in a floodplain at Susa, and why did no one answer it? And when Alexander burned the capital, what was he truly trying to destroy, the walls or the memory behind them? Over the next chapters, we will uncover lost tokens, broken oaths, invisible bridges, and a map that defies history. We will follow gold that never arrived and read the lies carved in marble. This is not just a story of conquest and collapse. This is the story of a breath that never stopped, and now we follow it. The mountains of Anshan are not gentle. Their ridges claw the sky and their slopes run with stone and silence. You feel it the moment you arrive. Not the welcome of a city, but the raw hush of a land that shaped its people with hardship and hunger. It is here, in the folds of southern Elam, that the first ember of the Persian Empire was lit. Not with ceremony or conquest, but with the quiet will of a tribe no one thought to remember, the Achaemenids, Highlanders, riders, nomads hardened by jagged hills and shallow soils. No monuments, no palaces, only memory and the will to become more. I came here following a rumor. A cracked inscription mentioned the name Cyrus, not the Great, not yet, just a name carved into a fragment of limestone, half swallowed by roots. It was dated to the 6th century before Christ, and it bore no titles, just lineage. Son of Cambyses, grandson of Thisbes, men who in their own time ruled only a corner of this vast plateau. The site was humble, a scattering of worn stones, a foundation of mud brick, wind-carved and barely holding form. But what lay beneath told a different story. Excavating through collapsed masonry, we found pottery marked with seals that spanned cultures: Elamite, Median, even early Babylonian. This was no isolated village. It was a crossroad, a cradle for something stirring. We also found weapons. Not many, but enough. Bronze blades dulled by time, spears whose tips had fused with earth. But more than the weapons, it was how they were arranged, set not in burial, but in storage, ready to be used again. As if this place, abandoned for centuries, still waited for the return of its defenders. Cyrus was born here, not into empire, but into tension. The Medes ruled the north. The Elamites lingered in the shadows of their own fading past. The Babylonians loomed to the west, confident and ancient. Persia was no more than a name on tribal tongues. And yet, something within these hills bred ambition. The early chronicles speak of Cyrus rising against the Median king Astyages. They say his own grandfather was the man he overthrew, bloodlines tangled in prophecy and rebellion. But the stones tell a subtler tale of alliances built in silence, of merchants who traveled east and returned speaking of a leader who gave land, not threats, of soldiers who joined willingly, not for gold, but for belief. Near a dried riverbed, we found a seal unlike the others. It showed a man standing between two animals, a lion and a bull. Both bowed. Beneath the figure, the word Shah was scratched, almost hesitantly. King. Perhaps the first time the title was carved in this tongue. Perhaps the moment the idea was born. Cyrus would go on to take Ecbatana, Babylon, Susa. He would free captives, restore temples, and write himself into the stones of the world. But it began here, in Anshan, among dry winds and stubborn trees. The empire did not rise with a roar. It flickered into life like a flame hidden in the hollows, fed slowly by vision, protected from the winds of stronger nations. And when it finally rose, it did not burn, it blazed. As I stood on that ridge, with the cracked sky above and the forgotten bones of Anshan below, I understood something. Greatness does not always begin in cities. Sometimes it begins in silence and climbs from stone. They found it near Pasargadae, buried beneath centuries of drifted soil, a fragment of tile, no larger than a hand, painted with the fading image of a bird, wings outstretched, head bowed. Its feathers were once cobalt blue, now dulled by sun and time, but something in its shape still whispered power. The locals say it was an eagle, but not an ordinary one. They call it the dream bird, the one that came to Cyrus before his rise. A creature that showed him the path of fire and ash and the cities that would bow before him. Whether it was vision or myth depends on who you ask. There are no official records of this dream, no cuneiform inscription confirming it. But the story lives, carried in breath, spoken at night by those whose grandfathers heard it from their grandmothers. They say Cyrus was still a boy when he climbed the sacred hill near Anshan. Alone, seeking clarity, he fasted, he waited. And when sleep finally took him, the eagle came. In the dream, the bird did not speak. It showed cities crumbling, rivers drying, thrones empty, and then, from the ashes, a figure rising. A man with no crown, no title, only a flame in his hand. The eagle circled him once, then soared into the clouds, and Cyrus awoke. Whether the dream came from hunger or heaven, something shifted. Those close to him noticed it. He walked differently, listened more, spoke less, and soon he moved. The rise of Cyrus was not sudden. It unfolded like a tapestry, woven thread by thread in silence. But the choices he made, alliances forged, enemies spared, gods honored, bore the marks of someone who saw further than most, as if he was not shaping an empire, but fulfilling something already glimpsed. Pasargadae itself speaks in symbols, built not for defense but for memory. The stone platforms are low, the gardens geometric and deliberate, and in the heart of it all, his tomb, simple, unadorned, yet defiant in its endurance. When I stood before it, the air around me felt different, still, not empty, just waiting. We found another piece of the eagle mosaic near the tomb's base, cracked, burnt, as if someone tried to erase it. But part of the wing remained, not spread in flight, but folded inward, like the bird was no longer soaring, but watching. There's a Zoroastrian belief that divine truth comes not in force, but in vision, that those who lead must first see not just the path ahead, but the shadow beneath it. Cyrus seemed to live this way. He did not rule through fear. He offered freedom to captives, rebuilt temples for foreign gods, and called himself king, not of a people, but of the world. And yet, he was not immortal. He died far from Pasargadae, on a battlefield lost to sand. The eagle did not save him, or perhaps it never meant to. But in the end, the dream remained, carved into stone, painted on tile, whispered in legend. History remembers kings. But legends remember dreams. And somewhere beyond the mountains of Anshan, where the winds carry dust across forgotten fields, the eagle may still fly, not in body, but in meaning. A sign that empire, at its heart, begins not with conquest, but with vision. We found them in silence, beneath a mound long thought to hold only shattered pottery and wind-scoured bones. But as we dug deeper, the earth gave way to steel. Not the crude blades of villagers or raiders, but something refined. Bronze dulled to a muted green, helmets lined in faded crimson cloth, and near the center, a mask. Iron, shaped like a human face, expressionless, eternal. This was not a battlefield. It was an archive of flesh and iron, a burial not of kings, but of guardians. The Persians called them the Anusia, the Immortals, 10,000 strong, they say. Always 10,000, because for every man who fell, another stepped forward, seamlessly, silently, as if death could not count among them. The Greeks were terrified of them. Herodotus spoke of their precision, their stillness, their gold not just as ornament, but as ritual. He said they marched without fear, shield to shield, eyes ahead. But what he could not see was the belief behind the steel. Each warrior carried more than a spear. They bore the weight of empires. Their presence at court was ceremonial. Their movement in battle, surgical. They were both symbol and sword, human and something just beyond. In the burial mound, the formation remained. Even in death, they lay as if still ready, feet aligned, arms at their sides, a few with hands curled around invisible hilts, as if still gripping a weapon long vanished. We cataloged the remains. Most were young, some not older than 20, yet their bones told of harsh training, healed fractures, worn joints, lives lived in motion and discipline. And beside them, we found amulets, small objects tied with leather cord, a tooth, a carved bird, a sliver of lapis shaped like an eye. Personal, sacred, proof that beneath the uniform lived stories we may never hear. The Immortals were more than warriors. They were a presence, a whisper in court chambers, a shadow in parade corridors. The very concept of them, that unbroken line of power, was part of the empire's illusion of permanence. Imagine being a rival king. You send scouts to observe the Persian army, and each year they report the same number, 10,000. Faces change, but the formation does not. You would start to believe what the empire wanted you to, that these soldiers did not die, that Persia's strength was eternal. But they did die, and here they are, quiet, still, their armor no longer gleaming, but heavy with dust. We tried to piece together their origin, who selected them, what oaths they took. Some texts suggest they were Persian nobles, others that they were chosen from all corners of the empire, loyal not to tribe, not to God, but to the throne itself. And yet, in one corner of the site, we found a soldier buried differently, not in formation, but alone, facing west, his hands clasped around a sealed jar, inside a folded cloth and a single coin. Greek, perhaps a prisoner, perhaps a defector, perhaps something else. The Immortals vanished when the Empire fell. No record tells where the last 10,000 stood, but their legend outlived them. Artists painted them, writers feared them, and now we uncover them. Not ghosts, not gods, just men trained to become myth. And when the wind moves across their resting place, the reeds sway in perfect rows, like spears, like memory, like an army that still waits to rise. Babylon was never meant to fall. Its walls were legendary. Its ziggurats reached into the skies like stairways to forgotten gods. The Euphrates split its heart, and within its veins pulsed the knowledge of centuries. For millennia, it was the jewel of Mesopotamia, eternal, proud, divine. But then the flame came, not a fire of destruction, but of transformation, and it bore the name Cyrus. The conquest of Babylon was not a siege in the traditional sense. There were no battering rams, no fire flung over walls. The records say the city fell in a single night, and barely a sword was drawn. Some accounts whisper that Cyrus diverted the Euphrates, entered beneath its walls, and took the city before anyone even sounded an alarm. Others say the gates were simply opened, that Babylon welcomed the Persians like long-awaited guests. We found no evidence of widespread destruction, no scorched layers, no sudden collapse of civic life. In fact, the temples remained, the markets reopened, the gods were untouched. That is what makes this conquest so strange, so delicate. Among the ruins, we uncovered a small clay cylinder, broken but still legible, cuneiform wrapped around its sides like coiled breath. The so-called Cyrus cylinder. In it, he names himself not a conqueror, but a liberator. He claims the Babylonian god Marduk chose him, guided him, and blessed his rule. Such words were not hollow. He restored shrines, he released prisoners, he allowed exiled peoples, including the Judeans, to return to their homelands. A conqueror who rebuilt rather than razed, who bowed to foreign gods to gain the loyalty of their people. And yet, this was not humility, it was brilliance. Cyrus understood something that many emperors would forget, that an empire ruled through fear must always watch its back. But an empire ruled through inclusion can turn even the defeated into defenders. In the southern quarters of the city, we found a layer of ash, not from war, but from ritual. A ceremonial fire, long buried, contained fragments of burned offerings from various traditions, Babylonian, Elamite, and even early Zoroastrian. It was as if the city, for a moment, became a crucible of beliefs, not erased, but merged. The Persians did not erase Babylon, they absorbed it. In fact, they made it their administrative center. Babylon became a jewel in the Achaemenid crown. From its archives, they sent orders that reached the Nile, the Indus, the Aegean. From its temples, the calendar of the empire was maintained. It lived even as it bowed. But not all were pleased. Later Babylonian chronicles show a slow resentment. The Persians were foreign, their gods strange. The people obeyed, yes, but the soul of the city grew restless. By the time Darius ruled, revolts had begun. Babylon, proud as ever, could not be truly tamed. Still, Cyrus's moment remains unparalleled. To walk into Babylon and not burn it, but light a different kind of flame, that is legacy. When I held the fragment of the cylinder in my hands, I felt its warmth, not literal, symbolic. It had survived centuries in the ground. Yet its words still spoke, a promise of power without cruelty, of rule without ruin. Cyrus died not long after, far from Babylon. His tomb lies quiet in Pasargadae, but here, in the heart of an ancient city, his fire touched stone and never fully left. Babylon fell, but it did not crumble. It was rewritten, and the hand that held the pen did so with fire. The first time I saw it, I could not breathe. Persepolis. Its columns rose like petrified trees, reaching toward a sky that had long forgotten the kings who built them. The stone shimmered under the desert sun, not with gold or gem, but with heat, the kind that makes silence echo. Built by Darius, extended by Xerxes, and refined by Artaxerxes, Persepolis was not just a city, it was a statement, a monument carved into the face of time itself. This was the ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid Empire, the place where the world came to bow. The entrance alone speaks in metaphor, the gate of all nations, a massive structure flanked by winged bulls with human faces, guardians of a dream made real. Step beyond them and the air shifts. You are no longer in Persia, you are in the center of the known world. We walked slowly through the remains, not out of reverence, but because each stone demanded attention. The reliefs were still intact, lines of tribute bearers frozen in procession, Ethiopians with ivory tusks, Medians with horses, Indians with gold, all carved with care, not as caricatures, but as individuals. Each figure bears gifts, each face bears story. This was diplomacy etched in limestone, an empire presenting itself not as a conqueror, but as a host, and yet the scale overwhelms. The Apadana, the grand audience hall, once held 72 columns, each as tall as a tree. Their capitals, shaped like bulls and eagles, now lie toppled across the platform like fallen gods. Still, you can feel the weight of their presence. This was where Darius received the world, not in private chambers, but in full display. The craftsmanship is staggering. Every inch of Persepolis was made to endure, and yet it did not. We found scorch marks on the eastern walls, melted fragments of ivory, charred wood. The fire that consumed Persepolis came quickly, likely started by the soldiers of Alexander. Whether by command or chaos, the result was the same. A flame meant for glory turned into ashes, but the stones remember. In one of the palace corridors, we uncovered tablets, small, unassuming, made of clay. But their content was revolutionary. These were the records of workers, men and women paid in rations, tracked by name, gender, and profession. This was not a faceless machine. It was an economy, a structure, a pulse. Persepolis, for all its grandeur, was not just a monument to kings. It was a living system, one that moved grain, gold, and people across thousands of miles with astonishing precision. And perhaps that is what makes its fall so haunting. This was not the collapse of decadence. It was the silencing of rhythm. As we stood at the northern edge of the terrace, overlooking the desolate plain, a wind picked up. It moved through the columns, humming softly. Not a sound, but a presence, as if the empire still whispered. This place was never meant to last. No empire is. But Persepolis was never just about power. It was about vision, about the belief that stone could speak, that art could unify, that the world, diverse and vast, could come together in a single harmonious design. Even now, the message holds. Persepolis is broken, but not defeated. It stands, not in strength, but in memory. A stone script carved by those who dared to dream in granite. and who even in ruin still speak. The deeper we descended, the cooler the air became. Not cold, but dense, thick with the stillness of a place long sealed. Behind stone thresholds and forgotten corridors, we entered what the locals called the silent chambers. And they were right. Not a sound, not even the wind. This was not Persepolis as most knew it, not the grandeur of its terraces or the open majesty of its courts. This was something more private, buried deep within the royal platform, a place not built for spectacle, but for remembrance. Here Darius spoke, not with voice or decree, but with stone. The inscriptions we found were carved with obsessive precision, the same message repeated in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, not simply for understanding, but for reach. Darius wanted all who read these words, all within his empire, to know the story he told. I am Darius, the great king, king of kings, king of the lands far and wide. But the tone was not prideful, it was deliberate, like a man rehearsing his legacy, a man aware that time would forget unless he carved his truth into walls. We brushed away the dust, revealing entire panels untouched by fire or looting. They had survived the fall of Persepolis. Hidden, preserved. Here, Darius outlined his lineage, his victories, his gods, and most curiously, his fears. One passage stood out, not for what it said, but for the way it was framed. A prayer to Ahura Mazda, asking for protection against the lie. Not enemies, not rebels, but falsehood. It struck me that the man who ruled over the largest empire the world had yet seen feared deception more than invasion. Perhaps he understood something we forget, that no empire falls by the sword first, but by the unraveling of truth. In another alcove, we found an unfinished inscription, just a few lines, hastily scratched. It was different from the others, less formal, more urgent. It read, "Let it be known that I, the son of Hystaspes, did not steal the crown." Then it ended. Why it was left incomplete, we may never know. But it hints at the cracks behind the stone, at a ruler who, even in his fortresses, could not silence doubt. The chambers were also strangely human. We found tools, not weapons, carefully stored in a stone box, a stylus, a chisel, a folded cloth. Someone had worked here, perhaps a royal scribe, perhaps Darius himself. Zoroastrian influences were clear. The rooms faced the rising sun. Light wells were carved into ceilings, channeling sunlight into darkness, not for warmth, for meaning. These spaces were sacred, not tombs, but testaments. And yet, not all was clarity. Symbols etched on the floor did not match known languages. Swirls, lines, an older script perhaps, or a code. They seemed out of place, as though someone else had entered these halls long after the king and left their own mark in shadow. Standing there, surrounded by words meant for eternity, I could not help but feel watched, not in fear, but in awareness, as if Darius had not truly left. These were his truths, his attempts to frame the chaos of rule into something that might last beyond the fall, beyond the fire, beyond forgetting. The chambers may be silent, but silence is not absence. Here, Darius still speaks, not as a god, not as a tyrant, but as a man trying to be remembered. It was not made of gold, but of gravel and dust, not marked by monuments, but by worn stones and the bones of wheels long gone. The royal road, the spine of an empire. Stretching from Sardis in the west to Susa in the east, this ancient artery ran for nearly 1,700 miles. It crossed deserts and rivers, climbed mountain passes, and linked cities older than memory. And though centuries have eroded much of it, parts still remain, cracked, sun-baked, winding through fields where no one walks anymore. But once it pulsed with life. We traced its course through Anatolia. On the edge of a ruined outpost, we found a fragment of a stone marker, the inscription barely visible, eaten by rain and sun. But the direction was clear, east, always east, toward the heart of Persia. The royal road was not a road in the way we think of them. It was a system, carefully measured, meticulously maintained. At intervals, stations were built, places to change horses, rest couriers, store supplies. The Persians called them Pyridasiash relays. From one to the next, messages would fly. Herodotus wrote that nothing moved faster, not snow, nor rain, nor darkness of night. He spoke of riders who could carry royal commands across the length of the empire in just 7 days. 7 days to cross a continent. And it was not just for messages. Traders, scholars, diplomats, and soldiers all moved along its path. The road turned distant provinces into neighbors. It made an empire feel whole. At one dig site near Arbela, we uncovered clay tablets stamped with shipping manifests, grain, copper, wool, sent from Lydia, bound for Persepolis. Alongside them, a small token, a carved lion with a hole through its back, a child's toy perhaps dropped in the dust by a merchant's son. The road carried more than goods. It carried stories, languages, faiths. We found a lamp made in Egypt with Greek inscriptions buried near a Zoroastrian fire altar in the Zagros Mountains. 3 worlds touching without violence. That was the miracle of the royal road. Not that it moved armies, but that it moved people. And yet, it was also a tool of power. A king could learn of a rebellion within days. Armies could be summoned, dispatched, deployed before the enemy even reached their walls. The road gave the throne reach and presence. Even now, when you walk it, you feel that presence. The ruts are deep where chariots once rolled. The stones shimmer with heat, and sometimes you find footprints. Not modern, fossilized, pressed into the earth centuries ago. Still there, still walking. In one abandoned station, we uncovered a sealed compartment. Inside were 2 letters preserved in wax-lined leather, written in Elamite. One was a tax report, the other a love poem, perhaps never sent, or maybe never received. That is what the royal road was, a path between hearts as much as cities. Today, highways roar with engines and haste, but here, the quiet is profound. The wind still walks where the couriers once rode. The stones remain, even as nations rise and fall around them. This was not just a marvel of engineering, it was the breath of an empire, a road that stitched the world together and still whispers its map into the dust for those who know how to listen. In the highlands of Yazd, the wind moves like breath. It twists between crumbling stones and brushes across ancient thresholds that no longer open. And if you listen closely, if you wait long enough in the stillness, you might hear it, the crackle, the whisper, the memory of fire that never went out. This is where the sacred flames once burned. In the Atashkadeh, the fire temples of Zoroastrian belief. Most are ruins now, their domes collapsed, their sanctuaries blackened with soot. But some remain, hidden, guarded, unmarked on maps but not forgotten by those who remember the old prayers. We entered one just before dawn. The doorway was narrow, carved from limestone. Inside, the scent hit us first, not of decay, but of ash and resin. Something fragrant, something clean. The fire was gone, long cold, but its ghost remained. Zoroastrianism is older than empire. It speaks of a time before kings, a time of cosmic struggle between Asha, truth, and Druj, the lie. A battle not fought with armies, but within every choice, every breath. Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, creator of light, order, and harmony. He did not demand conquest. He called for understanding, purity of thought, clarity of purpose. It was this faith that shaped the Persian soul. Cyrus honored it. Darius carved it into the cliffs. Xerxes built altars beneath the stars. But what the kings codified, the people lived. And the fire was its heart, always burning, always tended, not because it was divine, but because it reminded them to be. In the temple's inner sanctum, we found a basin of blackened stone. Once it held the sacred flame, fed constantly by wood chosen according to ritual. The priest would never blow on it. Breath seen as impure could not touch what was holy. Even water was kept at a distance. Around the basin, faded murals told the story of creation. Sky, earth, water, plant, animal, man. And then, the test. The lie enters. The long struggle begins. We found inscriptions scratched into the walls, not by priests, but by pilgrims. Some no more than names, others prayers, cracked Farsi, Middle Persian, even Greek. One read, "May my thoughts be clean, my words be just, my deeds be kind." A whisper from a soul long gone. These temples were more than places of worship. They were mirrors, each flame a reflection of the self, each visit a reckoning. The empire stretched from Egypt to India, but its inner compass pointed here, to these small fires tucked in hills, where truth was not debated but lived. And then it changed. When Alexander came, he claimed to respect the old ways, but his men mocked the rituals. Fires were extinguished, temples repurposed, some forgotten, others buried to preserve their sanctity. Even centuries later, under new empires and new gods, the flames struggled to stay lit, but in some places, they never went out. In a temple near Sharifabad, they say the fire has burned for over 1,000 years, kept alive by families who pass the duty from parent to child, who guard it not for power, but for memory. Because fire, in the end, is not just heat, it is clarity. It is what remains when all else is consumed. And in the echo of these temples, it still speaks, not in words, but in warmth. The desert does not forget. It buries, it bleaches, it breaks, but it does not forget. In the northern edge of the Dasht-e-Kavir, the Great Salt Desert, we found it. A twisted frame of a wooden cart, half consumed by sand, the wheels long gone, the axle splintered and gnawed by time. Around it, fragments of amphorae, bones scattered in a lazy spiral, clean and sun-whitened. This was not a caravan resting. This was a caravan that never arrived. The locals call the place Zarin Kak, the golden soil, not because of color, but because of legend. For centuries, whispers have told of a lost shipment of imperial gold, tribute bound for Persepolis. It was said to have vanished between the city of Susa and the capital, swallowed by a storm and never seen again. Most dismissed it as myth, a tale told by treasure hunters and dreamers. But here, we found something more. Scattered among the wreckage were coins, dozens, each bearing the image of Darius. His profile sharp, his beard squared, the royal headdress unmistakable. The gold was dulled, yes, but real. Minted in Sardis, never spent, never touched by market or temple. And it was not just coins. We uncovered seals wrapped in linen, still intact. They bore the marks of satraps, governors from distant provinces, Lydia, Bactria, Egypt. Each one a signature, a promise, a weight of obligation. But the question lingered, why this route? Why through the salt lands? The main arteries to Persepolis were well established, safer, faster. This path was death. We found no maps, but nearby, beneath a ridge of crumbling shale, we discovered a tablet, carved in haste. The language was Old Persian, the script rough and uneven. It read, "Changed course by command, fear in the west. Orders unclear, we press on." No date, no names, but a story emerged. Perhaps a rebellion in the western provinces forced a diversion? Perhaps rumors of unrest made the couriers take the long route east, through terrain unforgiving but less watched. Perhaps someone wanted the gold to vanish. And vanish it did. Not just the wealth, but the people. There were no bodies, only bones. And even those were scattered, incomplete. Wolves, heat, time. What once walked here with purpose now lies in pieces. Among the debris, I found something small, a child's anklet, bronze, simple, still clasped. It made the moment real. This was not just a treasury, it was a journey. It was families, guards, merchants, lives that vanished with the wind. The empire would have felt the loss. Perhaps not immediately, but somewhere in the records a gap would appear, an absence unspoken, a silence glossed over in the annals of bureaucracy. But the desert remembers, and now so do we. The gold never reached Persepolis, the tribute never entered the treasury, the names of those lost were never carved into stone. But they are not gone. Each coin, each seal, each splintered cart axle buried beneath sand and sun is a fragment of a story never finished. In a world of kings and thrones and gods, it is easy to forget the roads that connect them, the hands that carry their burdens. And when those roads disappear, what remains? In the end, not the gold, only the silence, only the sand, only the truth waiting beneath our feet. The papyrus was brittle. That thin sheet of reed, ink faded to rust, carried a weight heavier than gold. I held its edge between gloved fingers, felt its curl against a stone bench, and knew that it was not a document of victory. It was a record of rupture. In the land of the Nile, when the sun rose over the temples of Memphis and glinted off the waters of the great river, a quiet storm had begun. The empire of the Persians, ruled by Darius I, had stretched its reach into Egypt, claiming the ancient land with swords and seals. But here, in the silent hours, the provincials rose. The rebellion was not sudden. It germinated in the dust of villages, in whispered complaints about tribute and temples, about satraps and pharaohs who spoke with foreign accents. It was the kind of upheaval that does not roar. It seeps, it grows, and then it shatters the mirror. The papyrus was fragmentary. Lines were missing. Spots of ink had worn away. But enough remained. A soldier's letter from the western delta, complaining that temple offerings had been diverted to Persian treasuries, that local gods were neglected in favor of distant ones. A scribe's note tucked in the corner, we have sworn oaths to Pharaoh, now swearing to none. A final line, when the eagle of Persia returns, may the desert remember our debt. That last line haunted me. Who wrote it? A governor betrayed? A priest deserted? We do not know, but the sentiment is clear. The bond between Egypt and its conquerors had frayed. According to the Chronicles, Egypt rebelled during the final years of Darius's reign. Some scholars date the revolt to roughly 4 years after his failed Greek expedition, that is, somewhere around 487 to 484 BCE. The papyri and inscriptions show a hiatus in documentary record, as if the state's keystones were missing for a time. We traveled to the logs and ignored the propaganda, and found signs in the margins. The temple at Thebes showed traces of neglect. The granaries were half empty. And in one small ruin, we found the very papyrus, folded in leather, crumpled, hidden beneath the remains of a ritual table. The words spoke of broken oaths, not just to a king, but to an entire social covenant. Why did the Egyptians rise? Because suppression is heavy, because faith is injury, because a foreign throne had asked for tribute, men had been taxed to the bone, and the oracle of Egypt felt silent under Persian rule. The papyrus tells of temple lands seized and given to Persian nobles, of couriers riding through the desert with gold bound for Susa, while the farmers of the Nile Valley went unpaid. And then the eruption. When the revolt burst forth, the Persian response was swift. Darius marched into Egypt. According to one account, he arrived in Memphis during the mourning for the Apis bull. He offered a reward of 100 talents of gold for the next sacred beast, and the Egyptians, awed or cowed, or both, rallied to him. But the fact remains, the moment of revolt was genuine. The papyrus bears witness to that moment. It is not the official account. It is the underside of empire. I contemplated its edges, felt the brittle fibers. The wind in the ruin moved like the breath of those who wrote it, unheard, unhonored. The oaths made to one throne were broken in favor of another. Not always consciously, but inevitably. And now, centuries later, the papyrus lies in a cold vault. The revolt is a footnote in textbooks. But I came here to listen to the margins. I came here to feel the scrape of reed-on papyrus, the odd spacing of a scribe's hand, the tremor of defiance between the lines. Because history remembers kings, but it forgets the ledger of debts, the whisper of betrayed pacts. In Egypt, the empire of Persia did not collapse because of a single arrow. It faltered because promises were broken, because the papyrus snapped. And as I closed the ancient sheet, I realized the truth. A rebellion is not just a war, it is a ledger. Balances unsettled, oaths unpaid, voices ignored, and somewhere in the delta, the Nile still carries the dust of those voices. The map was old, not drawn by scholars in polished halls, but sketched on parchment, ink faded, corners curled. It showed the crossing of the sea, the watery gap between Asia and Europe, and a line of boats lashed together spanning the roaring strait. I held it in my hands and felt the weight of ambition pressing through dozens of centuries. This is the story of Xerxes I and his bridge over the water. The strait known as the Hellespont, the narrow ribbon of the sea that divides continents but unites nightmares. In 480 BC, Xerxes would order a bridge built where a bridge should not exist, where water swirled and wind roared. And the map before me shows more than engineering. It shows pride. The crossing is described by the Greek historian Herodotus: 2 pontoon bridges, one for the army, one for horses and baggage. Boats chained side by side across the water, cables made of flax and papyrus stretched taut like the throat of a king's demand. The width of the strait here is narrow, about 1,500 meters, but narrow only in measure. The currents and winds were fierce. The map shows lines across the strait, arrowheads pointing west. One engineer's note in shaky script reads, "Boats aligned facing current, screens on sides to calm beasts, roadway laid over timbers and earth." Practical words, yet beneath them lies hubris. We walked the shores at Abydos and Cestus, the 2 cities that faced each other across that span. Here on the Asian side, men must have looked across and seen Europe, and on the European side, they looked back and saw Persia. The map binds both shores, but only one conquered. The other resists. In the field, we found fragments of ropes, stone anchors half buried in the sand, more than 600 ships once used to carry the king's passing. Those anchors are ghost marks now, salt-corroded, sun-bleached, but they once held the weight of an empire's step. As I traced the map's shoreline, I sensed that this crossing was not just of land and army, but of worlds. Persia stepping into Greece, kings stepping into myth. The map, sketched hastily, reveals screens erected on the bridge to blind the horses so that they would not panic at the sea beneath. 2 red marks show where the storm first struck, destroying the initial span. Xerxes, in fury, ordered the sea whipped, the engineers beheaded, the currents branded. But the map holds a secret, a scribble in the margin. Bridge lies broken, but step remains. It hints that the crossing succeeded only in form, not in purpose. The army passed, but the spirit of domination faltered. The sea was raw, the horses uneasy. The weight of so many men shifted the balance of worlds. In the cartographer's ink, I read this: "A line drawn over water is not always a bridge. Sometimes it is a memory, a promise of dominion that trembles in the surf." I stood on the northern shore, wind gusting across the narrowing, and I felt the same tremor. The strait remembered the lashings, the anchors remembered the load, and I remembered what the map did not show, the aftermath. The conquering king withdrew, the bridges abandoned, the sea regained its course. Europe held its ground. Persia receded. The map remained a shadow of a crossing, an echo of a dream. And as I folded the parchment and re-rolled it into the quiet of the night camp, I understood the lesson. The bridge is gone, the empire faded, but the map still whispers. Across water, across time, across ambition. Thermopylae. The name itself carries thunder. Narrow gates, hot springs, a pass between mountains and sea where the fate of empires is said to have clashed. We remember it for the Spartans, for the 300, for the bronze and blood and sacrifice. We are told the story of Leonidas standing firm against a sea of Persians. The marble statue of the Spartan king still watches over the pass, sword raised, gaze fixed westward. But the marble lies, not in the sense of falsehood, but in omission. It tells only one story. Beneath the feet of tourists and above the whisper of winds, the battlefield sleeps. We came not to retell the tale, but to listen differently. In the soil beneath that monument, we found something Persian. Arrowheads, hundreds, each with the trilobe design typical of the Achaemenid army. Iron, corroded, but still sharp to the touch. They were not scattered at random. They were clustered, as if fired in a single overwhelming barrage. This was not a trickle of invasion, it was a tide. Farther down the slope, near the banks of the dried-up riverbed, we uncovered something rarer, a clay token, oval, palm-sized, stamped with the image of a lion and cuneiform text, a Persian pay stub, perhaps for a soldier who fought that day, perhaps for one who never made it home. He was not a villain. He had no speech, no legend, only duty. The truth is, the battle was never as simple as good versus evil. Persian soldiers came from all corners of the empire, Bactrians, Medians, Egyptians, even Ionian Greeks. Some may have shared blood with those they fought, others beliefs. The empire did not march as a horde, it marched as a world. But the story that survives, carved in stone and sung in song, is of Spartan valor, of glorious defeat. And yes, it was brave. 300 Spartans, a few hundred allies, against what may have been tens of thousands. Herodotus claimed over 2 million, though modern historians suggest closer to 150,000. The number does not matter, the resistance did. But it was not the end, it was a beginning. Xerxes passed, Greece burned, Athens fell, and yet the story of Thermopylae endured not because it was victory, but because it was defiance. Still, in celebrating one half of the story, we erase the other. The marble gleams white in the sun. But where is the monument to the fallen Persian? Where is the name of the archer who watched comrades fall to stubborn Greek spears, who bled not for tyranny but for orders, for empire, for belief? One-sided stories are simple. They comfort us. But history, real history, is crowded, conflicted, human. Standing at the edge of the pass, the same wind that once carried war banners now carries silence. The sea glitters to the east, the mountains keep their vigil, and the ghosts, all of them, still linger. The Greeks tell us Leonidas's body was found, beheaded but honored. The Persians left no grave markers. Their memory lies only in the arrowheads, the broken armor, the fragments that time has not yet consumed. We took a casting of the Persian token. It will rest in a museum now, but its original lies buried again. Return to the field where it was lost, where it belongs, because no battle is ever fully known. No truth is ever one truth, and no monument tells the whole story. The morning light came soft across the plain of Susa, cutting through mist and dusty air. I stood at the margin of the ancient city, where stone columns rise like broken teeth, and the ground underfoot has absorbed more rainfalls than human memory can hold. The story here is not just of kings and thrones, but of water, silence, and erasure. Susa, winter capital of the Achaemenid Empire, a city of palaces, of archives, of triumphs. And yet, hidden beneath its grandeur lies a secret, the flood that never made it into the books, the flood that buried more than walls. We descended into a low terrace beside the Shavor River, peeling back layers of silt and clay. The evidence emerged slowly, mud-cracked bricks at odd angles. A hall's floor buckled, stair treads gone faint beneath thick sediment. The inscription near the threshold read, "In the reign of Artaxerxes," but the text beyond was blank, as though the hands that carved it paused, looked at the water, then left. The great flood that struck Susa, I realized, was not the myth of a deluge. It was slow, creeping, a shift in the river's bed, a rising table of water that backed into the city walls, a winter of relentless rain, followed by spring thaw, then the desert silence. The palace dwellers fled or hunkered down. The corridors were emptied, the records closed, and the floodplain swallowed the rest. In one ruined archive chamber, we found clay tablets half buried in mud, not charred, not shattered, just dimmed by water, the ink of their seal impressions still visible, the transactions of barley, of textile, of tribute, and then nothing, no continuation. The ledger stops as though someone waded in, stood among the shelves, and simply closed the door. Why was this erased? Because the flood didn't fit the empire's image. The king's palace is meant to endure. The capital is meant to project eternity. So the water becomes a whisper, a footnote, buried like the silt that blanketed the bricks. We found another clue. A gallery of columns in the palace complex, set on a platform that once rose above floodwater, half submerged. The capitals resting at odd angles, the shafts speckled with algae stains. Someone long ago painted the waterline with ochre, perhaps to mark the rise. The flood remains without fanfare, a secret in the stone. And yet, this flood matters. Why? Because it reminds us of the fragility beneath the empire's grandeur. A king can build monuments. He can carve his name into cliffs, but he cannot stop the rivers. He cannot dictate the rain. Susa is testimony to that. Standing in the courtyard of what was once the Apadana, the wind quiet, the sprawl of the city sprawling like a half-remembered dream, I felt the weight of epochs. The flood brought change. Offices moved, palaces relocated, the winter capital shifted, the empire adapted, but the story of water climbing and walls bending, remains in the silence of the bricks. We leave behind the restored columns, the lifted foundations, the curated artifacts. And what remains? Forgotten floodlines, the stains on palace walls, the half-written inscription, the ledger that ends in muddy brown, a city that stood at the edge of control and found itself claimed by nature. As the sun set, turning the ruined stones pink, I made one final observation. Empires think their script will last. Kings assume their names will echo. But sometimes the only record is subtle. The shift of sediment, the indistinct smear where water lifted sofas, robes, scrolls, and the echo of that flood slips into the ground, into the mounds, into memory. Another piece of the puzzle, another secret swallowed by time. But here, we have looked. Here, we have listened. The fire still lives in the stone. You can see it when the light shifts, blackened streaks across the thresholds of Persepolis, melted plaster on the base of pillars, ash fused with fragments of ivory and shell. Not the result of time or decay, but of something swift, intentional. This was no accident. This was an ending. Alexander of Macedon stood before Persepolis in the spring of 331 before Christ. The gates opened. The city did not resist. It was the ceremonial heart of Persia, the monument to Achaemenid order, beauty, and rule. And Alexander, having already defeated Darius III at Gaugamela, walked into its heart as its new master. The accounts vary. Some say he admired it, others say he resented its grandeur, a symbol of an empire he had sworn to conquer. But all agree on what came next, the burning. It happened after a feast. Wine flowed, dancers swayed. Stories claim a woman named Thais urged him to destroy the city, to avenge Athens, to erase the memory of Persian invasions into Greece. Whether she spoke those words or not, the torches were lit. But when we walked those ruins, we saw a pattern. The fire had not spread wildly. It had moved with purpose. The residential areas, the outer courts, spared. But the royal archives? Gone. The treasury? Emptied, then incinerated. The halls of record, memory, and law targeted, burned not to ash, but to oblivion. We found fragments buried in the deeper layers, charred remnants of tablets, slabs of stone warped from heat. One bore the faint inscription of a decree by Xerxes barely visible through the scorch. Another was shattered in pieces, likely once a census, now unreadable. Names gone, lineages dissolved. The palace itself had been built to endure. Darius and Xerxes chose limestone and cedar, lapis and gold. They thought the structure would outlive them, but fire cares little for dreams. We found statues with their faces melted, winged bulls cracked and leaning, the foundation stones themselves scorched. What Alexander destroyed was not just a city, it was a story, a lineage, a claim to order. And yet, some say he wept afterward. Perhaps he realized what he had done. Perhaps the weight of that throne, now reduced to embers, settled too heavily on his shoulders. Or perhaps he never intended to destroy Persepolis at all. Perhaps it was his generals, or the wine, or history itself rewriting the fire to suit a cleaner narrative. But the damage was real. The capital never recovered. The empire, already fractured, lost its axis. With Darius dead, the satraps scattered, and the sacred fire dimmed, Persia lost its breath. Alexander moved on, eastward, toward India, toward myth. But Persepolis stayed behind, smoldering beneath desert skies, forgotten by kings, buried by centuries, remembered only by stone. We took samples of the ash layers, measured the carbon, traced the heat scars. What they revealed was chilling, a blaze that burned hot, fast, and with precision. It was not a riot, it was a purge. What kind of conqueror silences the voices of the past? What kind of victor fears the words of his predecessors? As I stood amid the ruins, dusk falling, shadows long, I ran my hand across the blackened wall. The soot still clung, centuries later, a reminder not of conquest, but of erasure. The Achaemenids ruled through architecture, through record, through the permanence of inscription. Alexander knew that. And so, the throne did not fall in battle, it was left burning. In a cave near the southern Caspian coast, carved above a ledge no wider than a man's shoulders, we found it. Graffiti. Not ancient, perhaps 200 years old, written in cracked Farsi with a sharpened coal stub or maybe just burnt wood. It read, "Cyrus was our father. His empire sleeps in our blood." No monument, no ceremony, just a whisper scratched into stone. But it said everything. The Persian Empire did not vanish. It dissolved into memory. After the fire at Persepolis, after the death of Darius III, after Alexander moved east, the structures faded, the roads went quiet, the satraps either fell or bowed to new thrones. But the soul of the empire, the vision that once stitched a continent together, endured. In fragments, in stories, in the blood of farmers and poets, soldiers and wanderers, even as other empires rose, Parthians, Sassanids, Arabs, Mongols, each one, in its own way, touched the echo of that old order, in administrative records, in road systems, in court rituals, even in language. We found traces of Achaemenid scripts carved into forgotten wells, Zoroastrian fire temples rebuilt in secret, royal seals repurposed into family talismans. All around Iran, Turkey, Iraq, pieces of something larger, not whole, but not lost. In the hills near Hamadan, a shepherd showed us a rock his grandfather called the King's Table. It was no table, just a slab with faint carvings on the edge. But the name had stayed in his family for generations. He didn't know who the king was, but he believed it mattered. That is how memory works. The empire had stretched from the Nile to the Indus. It had unified dozens of cultures, hundreds of languages, tens of millions of lives. And yet, what remains is not a single monument or city. It is a mosaic, a memory passed down, not through conquest, but through belonging. In Yazd, an old man recited lines of poetry beneath a mud-brick dome. He called Cyrus the gentle hand and said the real empires are not made with steel, but with story. His words were cracked like the ceiling above him, but I believed everyone. The West often remembers Persia as the villain, the shadow behind the spear, the force that stood opposite Greece. But for centuries, it was something else, a map that could stretch, a rule that could adapt, a vision that believed even foreigners could belong if they honored the throne, if they respected order, if they understood the value of unity. That idea did not die with the kings. It settled into soil, and now it rises in subtle ways, in place names, in ritual practices, in myths retold in the hush of firelight. The empire became legend, then memory, then blood. As we packed up our camp near that Caspian cave, I looked back at the scrawl one last time. His empire sleeps in our blood. The words were uneven, childlike, almost accidental, but they spoke to something eternal. Because no empire truly dies, it changes form. Stone crumbles, thrones fall, archives burn. But if the people remember, if a shepherd still tells the story, if a cave still holds the name, then the empire still breathes, not in power, but in presence, and that is the final secret. The last light fades behind the Zagros Mountains, and the wind carries the scent of dust and distant fire. I sit here now, journal open, the silence around me as old as the stones beneath my boots. 15 fragments scattered across centuries, scattered across deserts and rivers and broken cities, and yet they feel connected, not by bloodlines or timelines, but by something deeper: memory, presence, echo. The Persian Empire was not just a realm of kings and conquest, it was an idea, one carved into stone, etched into clay, lit by sacred fire, and walked across on roads that knew no end. It was a breath shared by 1,000 voices, a chorus of cultures woven into something vast and alive. We found the first flame in Anshan, humble, quiet, determined. Then a dream with wings, whispered to a boy who would become the great. We followed shadows that never died, soldiers who became myth, and touched the place where conquest did not destroy, but transformed, where fire entered Babylon and left it breathing. We climbed the steps of Persepolis, walked the silent chambers of Darius, and followed the road that connected the world. We knelt in fire temples, traced vanished caravans, and read the bitter ink of rebellion. We crossed ghost bridges, uncovered lies in marble, and stood where flood erased a city's name. And finally, we watched an empire burn, and yet not vanish, because memory lingers, in the soil, in the stories, in the names whispered in caves, the coins lost in sand, the prayers lit by flame that never quite went out. This was never just a history lesson. This was a reminder that power fades, but presence remains. And if you listen, truly listen, the past is not gone, it is waiting. Waiting in the cracks of old capitals, in the hush between stones, in the rhythm of footsteps tracing ancient roads. I close my journal now, another piece of the puzzle, another secret swallowed by the ages. But I have learned one thing on this path: history does not whisper, it waits.